is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Climate change. You don't have to travel to the North Pole or even Alaska to see its effects. In fact, you just have to observe what's going on in your backyard. Today, Where We Live, we check in with scientists and science writers about how plant and animal species are changing right here in New England. They're using historical records to analyze the biological impacts of climate change. What have you noticed where you live? Are your flowers blooming earlier? Are you noticing insects or other animals earlier in the season? Comment on our website, WNPR.org/where we live. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Joining me from Boston at the Mix One Studios is Richard Premack. He's professor of biology at Boston University, author of Walden Warming, Climate Change Comes to Thoreau's Woods. Hi, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Lucy. It's great to be here.
So can you take us back in terms of your research? When did you first start studying climate change and the impacts here in the Northeast?
Well, I'd always been doing my field research in Southeast Asia on the island of Borneo. And then a dozen years ago, when I was working on a textbook of mine about the effects of climate change, I wondered why we were always looking for examples of climate change from faraway places, like, for example, northern Alaska or Canada, or the mountains of Europe. I wondered why we couldn't see the effects of climate change right around here in southern New England. And so a dozen years ago, with my students, we began looking for old historical records, which we could then compare to modern observations to see if there were any shifting patterns in plants and animals to detect the effects of climate change.
And so I'm reading that Concord, Massachusetts became your primary focus of your research. How'd you settle on Concord?
Well, we found there were lots of historical records in southern New England. This is an area where there's a tremendous concentration of universities and research institutes, a very long tradition of naturalists. But of all the records that we uncovered, and we uncovered many records from throughout the region, but the records from Concord were quite amazing because they were established in the 1850s by Henry David Thoreau. At that time, he was interested potentially in writing a book about the seasons and looking at changes in the seasons. So he began to make very detailed records of when plants were flowering, when trees were leafing out, when birds were arriving in the spring, and many other natural history phenomenon. And as soon as we saw these records, we knew that these would be quite amazing because they were not only very detailed and conducted over an 8-year period, but they were made by Henry David Thoreau, author of Walden, who is such a famous environmental writer and philosopher.
Can you talk about some of his observations and what you and your other fellow researchers are seeing here in New England?
Well, we began making very detailed observations in 2004, and we were attempting to repeat as closely as possible the observations that Thoreau made around Walden Pond and elsewhere in Concord from 1851 to 1858. And what we began to see very quickly was that plants in particular were flowering earlier than in Thoreau's time. So, for example, the highbush blueberry in Thoreau's time was always flowering in the middle of May, but we were seeing it flowering in early May, sometimes in late April, and then in one amazing year in 2010, we actually saw it flowering in the beginning of April. So a 6-week shift in flowering time for this one particular species. So we see that the plants in Concord are responding to the warmer temperatures that we now have in the Boston area and throughout southern New England, and that plants are really responding to it by flowering earlier and by leafing out earlier.
And what about the insects that we see coming out in spring?
Well, unfortunately, Thoreau didn't make observations of insects, but we have very extensive records of butterfly emergence times and records of bee flying in the spring. And what these records all show us is that bees and butterflies and probably other insects are also responding to temperature, and they're also matching very closely the flowering time of plants and the leafing out time of plants. So both the insects and the plants are shifting quite dramatically earlier.
And are we seeing the growing season extended? Because, I remember this last winter, it was just so mild. And all of a sudden, I know in Connecticut, we got this snowstorm in April, which kind of dulled some of the early flowers. But in terms of what we're seeing in the last few years, at least since 2012, where we've had these very dry, hot summers, how does that impact our native crops?
Well, it's a very complex story, but the simplest part of it is that with an earlier spring, with warming temperatures in the spring, that farmers and gardeners can start planting earlier, plants start flowering earlier. And then in the autumn, because we have milder temperatures and the first frosts occur much later, that often the growing season is extended in the autumn. So home gardeners can grow a lot of crops like lettuce, for example, later in the autumn than they ever had in the past. The summer times are much hotter. So, for example, this summer is a very hot summer and a very dry summer. And for gardeners who can irrigate, then they are in very good shape, because with the hot, dry conditions, it's very good for certain crops, for example, like okra. And so if farmers can irrigate, then it's a very good situation. But on the other hand, if there's no irrigation possible, then it's actually can be quite disastrous for crops, because the fields become much too hot for the plants to grow. So, for example, in our garden, the squash plants and the pumpkin plants are all wilting. No matter how much we water them, it's just too hot and dry for them.
I've observed that in my home garden, but one thing that's really going strong are my tomato plants. They love the heat.
That's right. So certain plants really like the heat, but of course you have to water them. If you don't
Yes.
water them, then they'll quickly wilt and die.
Yeah.
The one interesting consequence this year is that we had a very early spring, and so a lot of our fruit trees like apples, pears, peaches, cherries, they all started flowering very early. And then we had a series of frost events in early April where the temperature dropped down into the low 20s in the Boston area. And as a result of this frost event, after the plants had already started leafing out and flowering, a lot of the flower buds and the young fruits on the fruit trees were completely killed. And so the fruit crop in the southern New England area has been very heavily damaged in this area. So, for example, our peach tree produced huge numbers of peaches last year, and there's not a single peach on our peach tree this year.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're speaking with Richard Premack. He's a professor of biology at Boston University, author of Walden Warming, Climate Change Comes to Thoreau's Woods. We're talking about how you can observe the impact of our planet warming in your backyard. You don't have to travel all the way to Borneo to see the effects of climate change. And I know, Richard, that your book, again, looked at historical records from Henry David Thoreau. I was reading some of that research, and with all of the wildflowers that he identified back in the 1800s, how many of those are still around from the research you've been doing?
Well, one very interesting consequence of our research on flowering time was that we noticed that there were a substantial number of the wildflowers that Thoreau had seen in Concord that we couldn't find. So an important secondary goal of our research was to try to locate a lot of these missing wildflower species. And eventually we concluded that about a quarter of the wildflower species that Thoreau and other botanists had seen in Concord, we couldn't find. And for some groups, for example, like orchids, the loss was even more dramatic. So out of about 21 species of orchids that Thoreau and other botanists had seen growing in the wild in Concord 100 years ago or 150 years ago, we were only able to find 7 of them. So there's a dramatic loss of wildflower species for certain groups. And this is actually quite surprising because Concord, for those of you who know Concord, it seems like a very wild place. About 60% of Concord is undeveloped, and about 30% of it is very strictly protected conservation land. And so even with all of those protections, Concord is still losing a lot of its native wildflower species. And climate change is at least part of the reason why species are being lost. It's just getting too hot for a lot of the species in Concord today.
And what does that mean in terms of the invasives that are moving in?
Well, that's right. So a lot of the native species are dying out, and the place of those native species is being filled in by invasive species. So there's a lot of things changing in Concord, not only warmer temperatures, but deer populations, more disturbance by development and roads. We also have a lot of air pollution. So a lot of things are changing in Concord, and all of these things are tending to favor these invasive species. Some of them are new invasive species that weren't really around very much before, like spotted knapweed, but some of them are invasive species which have been around for a long time, for example, like black swallowwort. And a lot of these species which were fairly restricted in terms of where they were found before, so for example, often in very disturbed areas of cities, are now exploding in terms of their abundance in the countryside. So it's this combination of warmer temperatures, more disturbance, and also a lot more air pollution, particularly a lot of excess nitrogen deposition onto the soil from air pollution, which is really favoring these invasive species.
You mentioned the deer population. When we think about deer, we also think about ticks, and because of the hot season, the very mild winters, that's impacting that as well?
That's right. So that's a huge problem. So when I was growing up in New England, in the Boston area, I used to think that we had the most wonderful climate because there was really nothing that could hurt you in our forests or our fields. It was a very benign environment. It was a wonderful environment for children. But now, with these increasing deer populations, we also have greater tick populations. And the ticks are also favored by the mild winters. So we don't have a really hard winter that can kill the ticks and really knock down their populations in the wintertime. So the tick populations are building. They're also building because we have increasing thickets of invasive species, which are great places for all the rodents to hide, which are another host for the tick. So this combination of rodents, invasive species, and deer are really all favoring higher tick populations, which in turn can spread Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases. So now our forests, instead of being a very benign environment where nothing can hurt us, now we have to be careful all the time when we go in the woods that we wear long pants, we tuck our pants into our socks, we use insecticides on our pants, and we have to be very careful that we don't get attacked by the ticks.
And that's a real downer when you want to hike in 90-degree heat, huh?
Well, it's a real consideration. It means I don't let that prevent me from going in the woods,
Yep.
but it means I'm just much more careful when I go into the woods. I'm always tucking my pants into my socks, and I'm always looking at my body very carefully after I come in from the woods.
And, we were talking about butterflies and bees earlier in the segment. What are we seeing in terms of the birds and their migration up here to New England?
Well, that's a great question, Lucy. So Thoreau also made very careful observations about bird arrival times in the spring, and we have many other naturalists and birding clubs which have also making observations about when the birds arrive in the spring. And these all show the same pattern, which is that the birds are responding to climate change in some cases, but to a much less degree than the plants and the insects. So a lot of bird species, species like flycatchers and warblers, which are coming from Central and South America, they're not changing their arrival time at all. But other species, for example, like catbirds, which are coming from the mid-Atlantic states or the southeastern United States, are coming earlier now than in the past. Or hummingbirds, for example. We're seeing hummingbirds a little bit earlier, but not as much. They're not changing as much as the plants and the insects. And this actually has a lot of concerns for scientists because when the birds come in the spring, they're feeding on insects, and there's a big pulse of insect emergence in the spring. And of course, the insects are feeding on the plants. And if the birds are not shifting their arrival time as much as the plants and the insects are responding to climate change, there's a danger that when the birds arrive and they need food for themselves and for their nestlings, that they're just not going to get enough food to eat, and this might be harming their populations.
Is it possible that, you said that you're a native New Englander, do you worry that your backyard will one day be more like what we're seeing in Virginia or North Carolina?
Well, that's one thing which is going to happen. So for people who are children today, people who are very young today, that within their lifetimes, they will see the climate of New England gradually change from the way it is now to more like New Jersey or Virginia or even North Carolina by the end of the century. Already the climate of southern New England has warmed enough that we're more like the climate of New York City or New Jersey was 20 or 30 years ago. So the climate has already changed, but it's going to keep changing. And what this means for the native flora and fauna is that a lot of our cold-loving species, which are at the southern edge of their range already, are going to die out. So we're going to continue to lose species. And in the short term, a lot of those places where species are dying out are going to be taken over by the invasive species. And the hope is that by sometime by the end of the century or within a few hundred years, a lot of these southern species will gradually migrate into the southern New England region and start to fill in the gaps of our forests and fields and meadows.
We're talking to biologist Richard Premack about how historical records, specifically data Henry David Thoreau gathered in the 1800s, is now being used to track the effects of climate change on New England's animal and plant species. Are you a native New Englander? What have you noticed in your backyard? Are you a farmer who sees firsthand how the growing season is changing for native crops? After the break, we'll find out how climate change is impacting our marine life. This is Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about climate change and how global warming is impacting animals and plants in New England. Comment on our website, WNPR.org/Where We Live. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Richard Premack joins us from Mix One Studios in Boston. He's professor of biology at Boston University and author of Walden Warming, Climate Change Comes to Thoreau's Woods. Richard, I wanted to ask you the trends that we're seeing on land. Are they also moving into our rivers, lakes, and oceans?
Yes, that's certainly the case. That in the case, for example, of Walden Pond, it's melting earlier in the spring now than in Thoreau's time. A lot of the bodies of water are getting warmer. So we're seeing that as the air temperature rises, the streams, the rivers, the lakes are getting warmer. And this is having impacts for fish populations. So, for example, trout like very cold water. And as the temperatures warm up, a lot of bodies of water which were suited for trout fishing, for example, are no longer going to be suited for that because the temperatures are getting too warm for them. We're also seeing a lot of impacts on the ocean. Maybe the next speaker will talk about that in more detail, but the ocean levels are rising throughout the New England coast. Based on historical records, we know that the ocean has already risen by 8 inches and is predicted to increase in height by another 1 to 3 feet by the end of the century. And this will really have devastating consequences for New England unless we take measures to protect our coastline, because with that increase in height of 1 to 3 feet by the end of the century, many coastal areas of New England like Providence or Boston are going to be extremely vulnerable to storm damage when hurricanes hit the coast. That will drive the water over the existing sea walls and dams and cause massive flooding in low-lying areas, particularly areas that have been reclaimed in the past from coastal marshes.
I want to bring into the conversation now Carl Zimmer, science writer and columnist for the New York Times. Carl, you're on Where We Live.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. We know that you've written about how climate change is causing our marine species to relocate. Tell us how we're seeing that impact here in southern New England.
Well, I live in Connecticut, and Connecticut used to have a very thriving lobster fishery, and that's pretty much drying up now. You really don't see a lot of lobster catch here, whereas in Maine, things have been going pretty well. And what seems to be happening in part is that the lobsters are thriving further north because the temperature is warming, so that the ocean here in Connecticut may be getting too warm for lobsters to thrive, whereas in Maine, they're just kind of hitting their sweet spot. That's fine for Maine right now, but unfortunately the ocean is set to continue warming, and the more carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, it will warm even more. So that's just one of thousands of species that are being affected by this massive heating of the ocean that we're carrying out right now.
Now, earlier in the hour, we were talking about how our backyards may soon look, in the future, look more like Virginia, North Carolina. When we look at our species in the water, obviously the lobster population is dying out here in southern New England. But are we going to see more blue crabs like what you see down in the Maryland area?
So for a lot of species, if you kind of draw their range on a map, that range is going to move away from the poles. So towards the poles, away from the equator. So species in the North Atlantic are going to a lot of them are going to move further north. And so scientists in 2013 they looked at a whole bunch of different species all at once to try to kind of get a sense of the overall velocity of species in the ocean due to climate change, and they calculated that they're moving about 4.5 miles away from the equator every year. And that's actually 10 times as fast as what is being recorded on land. There's a pretty simple reason for that. The ocean is a big open place, and, you don't have to deal with a lot of mountains and deserts and so on. So for a lot of species, they can just swim and track the climate. Unfortunately, what that also means is that they're going to bump into a lot of other species, create kind of new ecological combinations, and not all species are going to be able to make that move. a lot of species are going to get trapped and get stuck in a climate that they're not suited for.
I wanted to bring into the conversation now. Jesse is calling in from Old Lyme. Jesse, you're on Where We Live.
Hi, thanks for taking the call. I'm an avid kayak fisherman here in Long Island Sound and at the mouth of the Connecticut River. And recently we're seeing lots of really interesting things. Like a friend of mine just caught a redfish off one of the reefs out in right off the coast here, and that's very unusual. And then for the first time, I think in history, the juvenile Manhattan bunker just didn't leave. We were seeing bluefish in some like former outflow at Millstone all winter long. We were just seeing baitfish that just never left. Seals were populating the mouth of the Connecticut River, chasing the baitfish, and as were the seagulls all winter. So it's just very, very interesting. And we're seeing different things coming in earlier. We're already seeing snapper blues, which is typically an August fish. Just the timing is really very interesting. So, it's encouraged to take logs of when you're catching these fish so year to year you can see the changes. And also, on behalf of the DEP, not that I'm speaking for them, but there is an angler survey volunteer program, being that there's only really 6 guys in the DEP office. I mean, it really is up to the anglers to really help keep tabs on what's happening out there. And I encourage people to go to the ctdep.gov site to get involved and become a part of the research that's happening.
Well, thank you, Jesse, for your call. And I wanted to go back to Richard Premack again, a biologist joining us from Boston. Jesse was talking a lot about, it's important for anglers to keep track of what they're seeing. How much is citizen science helping you in your research?
Well, citizen science is an increasingly important tool for scientists to use because, as Jesse points out, there's only a relatively small number of government people tracking climate change, a relatively small number of scientists in comparison to the size of the United States. And there are now these citizen science networks being set up throughout the United States by many groups of biologists, other types of environmental scientists. And the help of citizen volunteers, sometimes called citizen scientists, is really necessary to establish a very detailed network to see the effects of climate change. One of the most successful of these over the last few decades has been the Journey North, which tracks the movement of monarch butterflies from Mexico through the United States to Canada. And this allows very, very detailed information to be available to scientists about how many monarch butterflies there are and exactly how far north they're migrating. And another very successful one is eBird, in which people can contribute observations of when they see birds throughout the year. Another one is the National Phenology Network and Project Budburst, which is very strong in plant-based observations. So these are all ways in which people can contribute observations, which then scientists can use to track the effects of climate change.
I wanted to go back to Carl Zimmer, a science writer and columnist for the New York Times. I'm sure you're able to hear the listener calling in who's a fisherman is seeing fish he's never seen before in Long Island Sound. Is this common all along the coast?
Well, every now and then, people may see something unusual, and, one observation at a time, could be explained by a lot of different things. Climate is sort of a noisy thing, and from one year to the next, you can have cold years and warm years. But the really important thing is when those observations start to follow a trend over many years. And so, unfortunately, what that caller was noting of starting to see fish that you'd expect further south or maybe not see until later in the year, seeing them pop up in unusual times or unusual places, that's becoming more and more common. And so that species, that we might be more familiar with down in New Jersey, we're starting to see them more up here. And that trend, just based on the climate models and ecological models, is going to continue.
I wanted to bring up a producer here at the station mentioned that in 2009 a manatee came up north, all the way up to the Cape Cod, Ilia. Do you remember that incident?
Yeah, and this, I think this is, one of the cases where, you've got sort of noise in the system. I mean, it just takes one manatee kind of going off course to make everyone look at it and say, oh my gosh. And, we get dolphins and whales showing up in unusual places. I mean, that's just part of the system. But you lay on top of that a trend where year in and year out you're starting to see more and more sightings of species in the ocean in certain latitudes that you weren't expecting, then you start to see the fingerprint of climate change.
Can we talk yes, go ahead, Richard.
Could I just add into that? Another interesting example is that we had killer whales showing up off Cape Cod this year, which are actually coming from the north. So that's a species which should be further north, but is coming south. But again, it's really these long-term trends that are important. And in the case of Concord, we've been following flowering time for 12 years. And any one year you could explain away as being kind of an unusual year. But we really have 12 years of records at this point from Concord. And they all show, just very clearly that plants are flowering much earlier now than in the past. So it's really these records carried out over many years which are the most effective for scientific purposes.
And Carl, I wanted to go back to you. You were hearing again about these fish that are moving further north. What about species moving out from the tropics and how that impacts food security for native populations?
So that is one of the really big concerns about how climate change is going to affect the oceans. As species move away from the equator, there aren't going to be a whole bunch of fish that somehow are really well adapted to incredibly hot waters. They just aren't there. And so when scientists look at the species we have today and basically try to project where they're going to be in 100 years, they find that the tropics are going to lose a substantial amount of their marine diversity. They're going to lose a lot of species of fish and other marine species. And, we as a species, we depend on the ocean a lot. We get a lot of our protein from fish and other animals in the ocean. And so if they suddenly disappear from the tropics, where an especially large number of people depend on the ocean for their food, that could be incredibly dangerous for us.
I want to take a call now from a listener. Bill from Windsor Locks, you're on Where We Live.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm well.
I got a large tract of woodlands, and I've noticed that the invasives are getting worse, mainly that Japanese knotweed. You just can't control it. You got any ideas of how you can get rid of it? We've done mowing. Mowing seems to be, but you got to do it like every 3 weeks. It just comes back real tough. But I've also noticed that it seems to be spreading. The poison ivy you can mechanically take down because it doesn't grow as fast, and the bittersweet and all that stuff, but it's getting up into the canopies. But then the Japanese knotweed along the banks of the river and so on and so forth is definitely getting bigger. Any advice? I'll take my answer off the air.
All right. Thank you, Bill, for your call. I want to go back to biologist Richard Premack. He's asking for what do we do when we see all these invasives coming in and choking the native plants?
Well, the most important thing you can do with invasive plants is to make sure they don't get there in the first place. So people have to know the invasive plants and to remove them when they first see them. That's the most effective time to prevent invasive species from getting established in the first place, is learn to recognize them and remove them when they first appear. But once they've established themselves, there's really two choices. One is to remove them physically, pull them out, dig them up, and the other is to release insects or other species which are biocontrol agents. So, for example, purple loosestrife, which was a terrible pest in a lot of our wetlands in southern New England, is now being controlled in many places through the release of a beetle which is very specific to purple loosestrife and which will dramatically reduce its populations. So these are really the best measures. But the other thing is to really prevent species from getting established in the first place. And one of the main contributors to the spread of invasive species are people growing ornamental plants in their gardens. And if at all possible, people should try to plant native species in their gardens and really take care that they don't contribute to the spread of these invasive species.
And one way to do that is not to buy plants from all those big box stores. I want to take another call. Kathy from West Hartford, you're on Where We Live.
Hello there. Thank you for taking my call. I think that citizen science is the best way to start to recognize some of the changes in our environment. I'm a science educator, and I advocate for people to put up a bird feeder. And I've been tracking two different species of birds to see when their migration patterns have occurred. I'm looking at the little juncos for the winter and the red-winged blackbirds in the summer. And so that might be a suggestion to really start to promote citizen science, because I think that people who are taking down some data can really contribute to the field of science.
And Kathy,
that's just my comment.
And Kathy, before you go off the phone, can you just tell us what you have been observing in your garden? You said you're tracking certain birds. What are you seeing in terms of the red-winged blackbird, for instance?
Well, actually, for the last 5 years, every single year they've come on the same day. So that's really interesting to me. However, my friend is in Martha's Vineyard, and he tracks hummingbirds. And he noticed that this year the hummingbirds came 2 weeks later, which was really surprising, but it could be contributing to the El Nino effect. And we're not sure, but he tracks hummingbirds out in Martha's Vineyard. So we've got a couple of my friends who have been tracking different species of birds. And like I said, the juncos also, the little black juncos who come usually in the winter, they've been coming the exact same day. So I guess nobody has told them about climate change yet. And maybe that's a good thing.
All right, Kathy, thank you so much for your call. Again, citizen scientists who are making observations in their backyards. I didn't want to end the segment without talking again specifically about flooding and, the threat to our coastline. Can we talk a little bit more, Carl Zimmer, about, what we're seeing along the Northeast?
Yeah, so basically the ocean is rising, and so what that means is that if you have storms that are going to be pushing water onto the coast, it's going to be able to get further in. And if you combine with that, the fact that we are essentially kind of putting more energy into the atmosphere ocean system, we're kind of charging it up for potentially in some places causing more storms. And so when you've got that combination, you can expect that we're going to be dealing with more flooding than we were accustomed to. I live along the Long Island Sound, and there are streets that 15 years ago would never be closed off from flooding, and now you just get used to it. During a lot of the summer, you just know you probably shouldn't drive on that road because it's flooded out. Unfortunately, we may have more and more of that in our future.
I want to thank Carl Zimmer, science writer and columnist for the New York Times, for joining us. We appreciate your time, Carl.
Thank you.
We're going to stick with Richard Premack and as we go into break, and we're going to find out about how there are organizations that are looking to conserve land to help in the fight against climate change. This is Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about climate change and how it's impacting the plant and animal species found in Connecticut and the rest of New England. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Richard Premack is joining us from Boston at Mix One Studios. He's professor of biology at Boston University, author of Walden Warming, Climate Change Comes to Thoreau's Woods. And joining us now by phone is Abigail Weinberg, director of conservation research at the Open Space Institute. Hi, Abby. You're on Where We Live.
Thank you, Lucy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you talk about the mission of this Resilient Landscapes initiative that you have? When did it start?
Well, we're really picking up right where our first speaker left off and asking this question about how do we ensure there are places for species to migrate. And we started to really think about this issue and realize it wasn't getting addressed by our conservation community in about 2012. And started a partnership with the Nature Conservancy and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation to address that.
So a resilient landscape, what does that mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what we're talking about here is places where species are going to be able to migrate. And so as we see all these shifts happening to specific species, where are they going to be able to land? How can we increase the likelihood that they will adapt and survive as the climate changes? So what we found and what science is pointing to is that our protected lands, that the base of state parks, federal parks, town parks that we have in Connecticut across the Northeast, those are the places that are most likely to provide refugia. And so when we look at what we've already protected today, what we find is we've done a great job at protecting these high elevation acidic rock types like granite. Think of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. And what we haven't done is protected the low elevation, really fertile landscapes that humans like as well, like our silt valleys and our limestone soils. And those places are actually preferred by a lot of species too. So our protected lands right now are set up to only protect about a third of the species that will need to adjust in climate change. So one of the just very basic pieces of resilience here that we're talking about is ensuring we have protection, we rebalance our conservation lands to focus on these low elevation fertile places.
As I mentioned, Richard Premack is also with us, a biologist from the Boston University. Richard, how vital are these tracts of land that are being conserved to try to keep these species around?
Well, I think they're absolutely critical because, as an earlier speaker mentioned, there are a lot of barriers to migration, and the more we can fill in the gaps between existing protected areas with these new conservation areas, I think that will be great. I think it's also an example of how we need not just to observe the effects of climate change, but also to take action. So Abigail's group is actually being very proactive, taking some action outside of the government to ensure that species have a place to survive. But we also need to be lobbying the government because the government is really the major determinant of protected areas in the United States. So we also, as citizens, we need to be telling our elected representatives and also joining political organizations ourselves and urging the government to take action to deal with this problem of climate change.
I'm glad you brought that up, government, Richard, because Abigail, I was wondering, how does zoning and ordinances factor in when you try to conserve these parcels of land?
Well, what we've done is we've identified 7 focus areas across the eastern U.S. and 3 of them in New England, and we've identified these low elevation fertile places where we have $11 million to spend in order to direct land protection into those places. That's our carrot to get conservation to really occur there. We're on track to conserve about 37,000 acres right now. So we are able to make progress. We can't do that without the government agencies putting in money as well. And so that money attracts other federal money, and that's really critical. But the thing about these places, these low elevation fertile places, is that they are places filled with people. This is where our farming occurs. This is where our human habitation occurs. So these are small parcels. The zoning is often very fragmented, a higher density zoning than up in the mountains where it's much easier to protect land. Land use planning is going to be critical really to the success of these efforts. It really can't occur unless we're partnering with the farmers, as we were discussing earlier, and with the towns that are working in these places and with the people that live in these places.
Overall, are you seeing that partnership occur, or is there, some opposition?
That's a great question, and I think that it really varies across the eastern U.S. But I think, because of all the observations that we were talking about on the show, it's more and more undeniable that climate change is occurring. Now, some people may be uncomfortable with the reasons for that, and there's an important sort of, care in how we communicate about making these changes to the way we live. But I think that overall, people recognize there's a need, and the thing is that the things that the species need are very similar to what humans need to protect them from climate change. So when we talk about protecting silt valleys that are around rivers, that is the same thing that will be needed to protect people from floods like Irene and Sandy. So there's a huge intersection and a really symbiosis to protecting what's needed for species migration and for humans to survive and as the climate changes.
I want to take a call now. Karen is calling from Chester. Hi, Karen. You're on Where We Live.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. I was listening to what you were saying about the decline of the fish population in the tropics, and I'm very concerned about the sea mammals that eat fish and what is going to happen to them. Can you lend some insight on what their situation might be?
Oh, I think that's a good question. Carl Zimmer, who was with us in the bee segment, he's no longer with us. I know he's written a lot about what's happening in with our marine life. I don't know if either one of our guests has any knowledge they could share about that question, about what's going on with whales.
Well, I think I could talk about that. I think that the situation with sea mammals is actually very desperate in many places because, again, people are increasingly altering the fishing stocks throughout the world. So as we over-harvest fish throughout the world and other animals in the ocean, then there's often less food for sea mammals like whales to eat. And an example of that is we're increasingly harvesting krill from the southern oceans for use as fish food in fish farms. And as we overharvest this krill, there's less krill for the fish to eat, and there's less krill for the whales to eat. So I think that we're also having these consequences to many mammals throughout the world.
I wanted to read a tweet that we're getting from a listener who says that Michael says he definitely sees the effects of invasive species. He notices his hemlock trees withering now and weeds like mimosa trees are growing. Abigail, I wanted to turn back to you in terms of, again, these parcels of land that are being conserved around the Northeast, including in New England. How are you able to keep these invasives out?
It's a great question, and I was glad to hear this come up earlier. And I think one of the approaches that's a little bit different that we're taking based on some of the science that's coming out is that there's going to be a question of change versus degradation. So what we want to prevent is degradation of our lands, and we want to make sure they're healthy and can regenerate and can support ecological processes like food webs and these kind of things. But what we have to recognize is that only a certain amount of intervention is really cost-effective and really going to work. So we could continue, as the earlier caller talked about, mowing our knotweed every 3 weeks. But that's going to, at some point, exhaust us completely. And we need to recognize that these new species are going to be part of our communities, and communities are completely reshaping. So it may take 100 years for these communities to reform and for some of the dominance of these invasives to balance. But we have to, at some point, admit that the change is going to occur. And so how do we make these decisions about what change we allow and where degradation is really the issue, and how do we address that as effectively as possible with the fewest interventions? So there's really a balance, and there's a lot of allowing that's going to be necessary to an adjustment to the new communities that are forming.
Abby, we're talking to you in Connecticut. We've been in this heat wave about 16 days now where we're looking at temperatures in the 90s. I'm just curious what you're seeing in the forests as this drought seems to be it keeps happening every summer.
Yeah. Well, what we're seeing is that we're dealing with a whole set of stressors. And so invasive plants are a stressor on the natural system, on the native species. The high temperatures and the lack of resources, including water, are massive stressors on our system. Development are, encroaching development onto these protected lands. Those are additional stressors. So all of this really is compacting to make for a system that is less resilient, that where we have less of these areas that are really functioning with their full have their ecological processes intact and can offer all the natural benefits that protected lands do. So what we need to do here is really focus on places that do remain intact, those places with less stressors where there are bigger areas of undeveloped, unfragmented places. And find those places with all those diversity of geologies, elevations that will support our species. It's not an easy task, and it does require regional thinking. We can't do this just locally, though every place has its role to play. So it's a huge challenge and a regional one.
Richard, you said earlier that everyday people need to do a good job lobbying government to help in terms of what we're seeing on climate change impacting our region. What else can everyday citizens do to preserve these native plant and animal species?
Well, I think that people have to take responsibility in terms of protecting the landscapes around where they live. That I think that people have to get out and really know the nature around them. They have to go out for walks. They have to learn the species of plants and animals. And then they have to be vigilant at making sure these areas are not developed, making sure they're not degraded by human activities or degraded by invasive species. So these are all a part of responsibility of taking care of the environment. But again, we have to be forceful in terms of lobbying the government as well. I'd just like to actually add one thing, which I think is a very important topic, which maybe Abigail would like to talk about as well, which is that a lot of these forests and ecosystems are changing because of a warming climate. And as species die out in them, which are native species, we need to think about potentially bringing species from further south, from places like New Jersey or Virginia or North Carolina, and then experimentally planting them in our forests to see if they will survive, to see if we can facilitate this process of ecosystem change. This is something that scientists call assisted migration, and it's something which is being very actively debated within the scientific community right now. The scientists haven't come to any agreement on this, but at least it's something that we should start thinking about doing experimentally to see whether we can facilitate this process of adaptation to climate change.
And Abby, we have just under a minute if you want to talk a little bit about this assisted migration.
Well, I can say that there are the National Forest System actually has a series of adaptation plans that they've set up, and a lot of them are doing just that and trying this out. They're planting tree species from the south, and the trick is that they can't get them from their local nurseries and these kinds of things. But it's absolutely true that that is the wave that I'm seeing, certainly in land management.
I want to thank Abigail Weinberg, Director of Conservation Research at the Open Space Institute. We'll have links on our website, WNPR.org/wherewelive, to find out more. Also, thank you so much, Richard Premack, Professor of Biology at Boston University and author of Walden Warming, Climate Change Comes to Thoreau's Woods. He joined us today from Mix One Studios in Boston. Thanks again, Richard.
Thank you very much for having me, Lucy.
Our show is produced by Lydia Brown and Jeff Tyson. Special thanks to Mark Hers for his help on today's program. Again, you can continue our conversation on our website, WNPR.org/wherewelive. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.